There's so much, I think, that goes into it. You can simplify it and put any narrative around it that you'd like, I think, if you want to from the outside. But the reality is there's a lot more raw emotion that's tied to most people's decisions in those things than there is wisdom and thoughtful consideration.
Jake Locker has made a few decisions over the years that have made headlines. He's a former college football star and NFL quarterback who surprised lots of fans with his choices throughout his career, including his decision to leave the pros after only 4 years. I'm Elizabeth Pearson Garr, and in this episode, we find out what it's like to walk away from being an NFL quarterback. Just a note, we had some technical issues during this interview, so the sound is a little wonky at times, but please stick with us. I think you'll be glad you did. Jake shares a lot of really personal stories and insights. I'm so happy that you made the time. I really appreciate it.
Excited about it.
Well, should we just dive right in?
I love it.
Okay. Well, I feel like the $1 million question everybody asks you, the big headline is, why would you leave the NFL and all the glory and all the fame and all the money? But I don't want to start there because I feel like that probably has a lot of layers to it. It's probably a pretty complex answer, and it's probably going to reveal itself through the course of our conversation anyway. So I'm kind of interested in going back and learning a little bit about the people who really influenced you a lot growing up. If it was parents, grandparents, some coaches or teachers, who are some of the people who really made you who you are?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I thought you were going to start with the question you're going to ask, as most people do. But I think it obviously shows why your podcast may be a little bit different. And you have some wisdom that you're going to operate in because I think you're hitting it on the head.
Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, I'd say in different ways, and I think through different seasons and to different capacities, all of the areas that you touched on, I'd say that I can look back and go, I had a wonderful family structure. So a mom and dad that were extremely present in my life, extremely supportive, but at the same time, they set high standards for us. And there was things that some of my friends could do that we couldn't do. And there was clear expectations in our family. Our parents were constantly stewarding us in what it means to be a community member. They didn't use that language, but I look back on it now as a parent myself of kindness towards other people and using your manners and general respect. And those are big things in our home.
Even if they had used that phrase, community member, as a kid, you don't really know what that means. But they were just modeling it probably and expecting it of you.
Exactly. They were modeling it and pushing us into it. I think those are the two things that I look back and go, my parents, whether they knew they were being intentional or not, or if it's just what they saw, so it's what they encouraged us to. But it was clear in our family that we were going to be a part of our community and that we were out of line when we looked at ourselves as greater than the community. And I think that was two things that I look at a lot of the experiences that we had with my mom and dad, my sisters included. And I think that was probably a big part of what we learned.
Has it influenced how you parent?
100%. 100%. I think that my wife and I talk about it all the time, and I actually use the language with my children, doing our best to try and help them understand that I think in a world that constantly is going to tell you you're more important than the whole, I totally disagree with that. And I think it's detrimental not only to the individual, but definitely to the communities with which they function in. I think it's why we have so much dissension and division right now is because we're all told to look out for ourselves, and that's not the community that we were designed to live in. It's not a world that breeds peace and unity. It's a world that breeds division and dissent. Children wear their selfish emotions on them. You can see it. I'm that same person. I just have learned how to hide it from people, in creative ways. As adults, we just have learned to mask it better. And so I think that through parenting, it's actually allowed my wife and I to individually kind of go into deeper depths of what that looks like to be a community member as well. But yeah, I'd say further than that, you look at my grandparents. Both my grandparents were married 60 plus years. And so, I saw marriage being valued, marriage being fought for, marriage being important. That was modeled throughout my family. And I'm thankful for that. Not perfect.
Yeah, nothing's perfect.
They're not perfect. It's not without its challenges, but it was lasting. There's lasting relationships, which I was surrounded by as a kid in my family. And we were really close with our family. So we were always at my aunts and uncles' places. I can remember going to games, and I had one of the biggest cheering sections at most games, and it was my family, primarily my family. Between my mom and dad and sisters, and then my aunts and uncles and cousins and grandma and grandpa, it was huge, and it was my family. And so, yeah, really strong family structure definitely is just a real blessing that I got to grow up in and among, and I'm thankful for that.
Those marriages that lasted so long, relationships require time and effort too. They don't just happen. I was thinking towards the big question you always get asked. You can't ignore things like relationships and expect them to be strong.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was, again, things that subtly were built in. Like, we had rules like you couldn't spend the night at a friend's house 2 nights in a row on the weekend. So you couldn't be gone Friday and Saturday night. And every Sunday we had family game night. So if you got invited to do something, you just knew Sunday night was off limits. And there was these things that were built in, that were intentionally built into kind of like our family structure, that I think subconsciously helped us to learn that, yeah, the way you get deep and real relationships is spending time with people. And something I was reading recently, this quote, and I thought it was just wonderful. The people that you're closest with are the people that you get bored with. When you get bored with people, you build bonds with people that you don't when it's always around an event or around something. That thing needs to be a part of it for your relationship to sustain, where the people that you just sit with and have no plan, the people that you just spend time with and you creatively come up with something to do, those are the people that you have the deepest relationships with, because you are going to talk about things that you don't talk about with other people. And so, yeah, I look back at my childhood, and those are things that I remember. Same thing with like my cousins, really close with my cousins, and they were the same age as me, and they played athletics, and we were best friends. And most of the time it was like going to grandma and grandpa's, and we'd go out in the yard, and it's like making up a game. It's like making up a football game, making up a baseball game, and just playing for hours. And we're just making things up, like different variations of like pickle and 2-on-2 football and 3-on-2 football and like all kinds of stuff. And that's kind of what childhood was like for me.
Sounds pretty great. So did you feel, I know you are a naturally gifted athlete, but did you feel pressure to excel in organized sports too? Or is that just something that you wanted to do? It came easily to you and you loved doing it?
Oh, definitely loved doing it. I never felt like I was forced to do anything. Now, I think the older I got and the more that the ability that I had was on display, I definitely started to kind of transition into a place where I felt pressure. I always loved playing. It was always my choice to play. But I think the pressure increased to perform and what that performance looked like, undoubtedly. That was just something that I think I was projecting on myself because I misunderstood my identity at that point in my life. And so I was serving that which I thought was my identity. I played because it was fun. I played because as a kid, free time, I chose to play sport. That was fun for me. That was what I enjoyed
with your
doing.
Cousins, you were even
with my cousins, and I get home from school, and my dad would get home from work, and Dad, will you pitch to me, or will you play catch with me? And I was doing that because that was fun for me, because I really truly enjoyed doing that. So I never got to the point where it wasn't fun to play. I always enjoyed playing. It was always fun to play. I think as I got older and more conscious of circumstances, I think the pressure to perform became different, rather than, you still enjoyed playing. I still got excited about playing. There was never a time where I didn't want to play. I just felt pressure that I didn't when I was younger.
Yeah, well, I'm sure the expectations get a lot higher.
Yeah.
The more that you get. I mean, you were a 3-sport athlete in high school, is that right? And then I know you were drafted into the majors for baseball, and then you turned that down to pursue college football at University of Washington.
Yep.
And was that just because you love football a lot more than baseball, or that was one of your first big decisions?
It was. Yeah. It was 17 years old, actually. I can remember being upstairs. There was this little computer area right next to my parents' room, and it was our one computer in the house, and Dad was there, and I had a conversation with him about it, actually, right there at that spot. And I can remember him saying, Jake, if you chose to do this, what they're telling you is, you'd sign your name on a piece of paper, and in one day, you'll earn more money than I've earned in my lifetime to this point.
Wow.
And I think that was just my dad's way of being like, hey, you're 17. I want you to understand the magnitude of the decision that you're making. I truly don't believe it was to sway me either way. I think it was just a father saying, like, you need to know and understand everything that's going into this. And, at that point, I can honestly, in my head, I was just like, well, shoot, I don't want to play baseball 12 months of the year. Like, 3 months is great, but it's a boring game to me. Like, for that long, I'd get tired of playing it. And I'm like, I love football. I love the contact, and I love the physical aspect, and baseball didn't have that. And so it was a pretty easy decision for me, just because I really, truly enjoyed playing football, and I was getting a chance to play it at the highest level that I could at that point, and that was exciting for me.
So you weren't swayed by the money.
If I'm being totally honest, I think at times it's like, oh, that was such a wise, or what, and I don't think of it that way, to be honest with you, because like I didn't even really truly consider it from that perspective. It wasn't ever about that. It was just about being a 17-year-old kid, being like, man, I enjoy playing football more than I do baseball. And I think partly not understanding financial realities. We didn't grow up in a family that had a lot of money, but we never needed for anything. And so, I
You followed
don't.
your
I think
heart.
I think a combination of all of those things. I felt at times people wanted to make that out to be like, oh, you were so mature, and to turn that down. And I don't look at it that way because I didn't feel like that was it at all. It wasn't. It wasn't because of a maturity level for me. Really, it was just what I enjoyed doing. No different than a kid choosing to play with one toy over another toy. It's like, well, he likes that toy better. I like that. That's honestly how I looked at it.
And then fast forward a few years, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, so you were quarterback for the Washington Huskies, and then after your junior year, you were projected to be maybe even the number one pick in the NFL draft, and then you decided to stay for your senior year. And that was
Yes.
what kind of went behind that, because that's a bunch of dollar signs also being passed up. But I
Yeah.
guess given your history, that's not your driving force. So is it just that you wanted to play your senior year and get your degree?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I think at the time I said it was about school, and that was a lie. It was a complete lie. I didn't. I went to college only because I was playing football, and I went to class only because I needed to stay eligible. If I'm being totally honest,
We love
not that you
honesty.
shouldn't.
That's awesome.
Not that I don't value your college education. It just that's not what I would have chose to do had I not had the opportunity to play. I didn't go to college because I wanted to get a diploma. I wanted to play football, and so I think the driving force for me was, to be honest, I felt like if I had left, I would have always wondered what we could have accomplished our senior year, just with the group of guys that we had and the direction we were going. I think when I decided to go to the University of Washington, I began to understand the history and kind of where we were at that point in history. And personally and collectively, I think there was spoken and unspoken goals of like, man, we want to be part of the group that helps turn this back into a program that Seattle's excited about, that the school's excited about, that has the opportunity to compete against the best teams in the country and has a chance to win. And we weren't there. I think as much as anything, that was probably the driving force, was some stubbornness and a desire to see the things that you thought you'd be a part of come to fruition. And honestly, we hadn't got to see that yet. We're still 5-7. We missed a bowl game. We'd never been to a bowl game. It'd been like 10 years. 2 years before, we'd been 0-12. I think as an athlete, as I reflect on it, I was driven a lot by the fear of failure. I think it was one of the greatest driving forces for me as an athlete, to work hard and to compete. And, I think I was afraid to fail. I didn't like failing. I think it's so funny. They asked the question, do you like winning more or do you hate losing more? And I was always somebody that hated losing more. Like, I hated losing. And so I wanted to do whatever I could not to lose. And that was real for me. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. That was
I think it's very common. I've talked to a few athletes and everybody says that.
Yeah, and so I think in that is probably the similar emotions to coming back. It was like, man, I felt like I was failing if I were to leave at that point. I felt like I personally, in my own heart, and not even verbalized to anybody, but what I had hoped to be a part of, I wasn't. And I felt in a lot of ways like if I would have left, I was a failure. And then I'll be honest too, I felt like in a lot of ways I was getting to play under a coach and in a system that was actually preparing me to play at that next level. I started to see what that was like, and I knew I wasn't ready. I knew that I needed another year of playing in an offense like they were going to put us in and having the responsibilities at the position that I played that they were giving me. Those things were still a challenge for me, reading defenses and correcting protections and making audibles. Like, those things were all new to me, and I was still learning them, and I knew that. And I knew that I think there's so much, I think, that goes into it. You can simplify it and put any narrative around it that you'd like, I think, if you want to from the outside. But the reality is there's a lot more raw emotion that's tied to most people's decisions in those things than there is wisdom and thoughtful consideration. And in so many ways, I look back on that and it's like, man, it wasn't because I was being extremely thoughtful and I was considering money, and I wasn't. I wasn't. And I think it was because all these other things mattered to me more. Like, I didn't want to be seen as a failure. That mattered deeply to me. And I personally felt like I would have been had I left. And I think that that was a great motivator for me.
You
Yeah.
mentioned earlier about there's more expectation on performance, and you did help turn that program around, and you guys went to a bowl game, and you were really kind of hailed in Seattle. Did that feel great, or did that feel like the expectation felt a little daunting?
No, I think I said it publicly quite a bit, but it was really the internal reality that's like everybody else can have expectations, but my expectations are greater than theirs are. And I always felt that way. It's like, yeah, you may want this, but I want something a lot more than you want. And I was in a position that I was going to be the one that could put in the work and put in the time, not to make that outcome a reality, but to influence whether it had the possibility to be or not, more than most people that were putting any kind of expectation on me as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, there's pressure. I think anybody that plays athletics on the stage that our country puts athletics on, if they say they don't feel pressure when they compete, I think they're lying personally. And maybe not. I don't know. I shouldn't, I guess, project that on other people, but I never competed without pressure. I'll put it that way. Once I got to college, once I got to high school, college, like there was never a time when I didn't feel pressure. I don't think pressure is a bad thing. I think how you relate to it can be wonderful or extremely destructive depending upon where you're at personally. But yeah, I always felt pressure, so I don't think that changed it. I can remember when I committed to go to the University of Washington, the headline in the Seattle Times the next day was a picture of me with in huge bold letters the word Savior
Oh
at
my
the top
goodness.
of the page, and I can remember that. And now where I sit now and the, kind of some of the understanding I have of the meanings that name carries and who it's connected to primarily, I didn't understand it at that point to the degree that I do now, but I understood it well enough to know, like, wow, people are expecting a lot of things from me. So I knew that.
Yeah.
I always knew that.
So how did you deal with the mental side of it? Not every game goes great for anybody, not
Yeah.
even the Hall of Famers in any sport. And so there's these expectations of you. You're in the marquee position. And how would you deal with the mental side of it?
I think probably healthy and unhealthy outlets. I think healthy outlets would have been working extremely hard at the things I could control. And I knew that was an outlet for me. So, like, the weight room and working out was a big thing for me. And it's because I could somewhat control outcomes in that space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it was tied to the time and effort that I put in. And so I spent a lot of time there. I realized when I was in high school, and I also had a dad that really helped me to see this from a very young age. He coached me a lot, and he'd always be like, hey, I'm going to be harder on you than everybody else for two reasons. One, because you're my son, and two, because you're the best player. And he didn't say that arrogantly, and I don't think he wanted me to receive it arrogantly. I think he just, was a dad that was looking at it going like, hey, I've been around sports, and inevitably the group a lot of times will model and resemble their best players.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it was his way of saying, like, whether you like it or not, you have a leadership responsibility because of the talent that you have.
Like you're a role model for the rest of the team, whether you like it.
100%. And if you're choosing to play sports, they're going to follow you. They're going to go as you go. They're going to do what you do. What you get away with, they're going to expect to get away with. Essentially, the standard that you set for yourself will rub off on those around you. And he was always very intentional about talking to me about that. And I look back and I was really thankful for that, because coming into the position that I did come into, it's an expected reality just with that position. And so I felt like I'd spent a lot of my life being encouraged and instructed how to walk through that, how to steward that well, what that looked like, how not to separate yourself from people, but how to infuse yourself into the lives of those around you so that they could go somewhere maybe that they didn't think they could go. And like learning these kinds of things, I think at a young age was helpful for me in that role. And so those are the two areas. I think the way that I dealt with it in a healthy way was my personal work ethic. And it's like, you know what, I'm going to set a standard here for me that isn't necessarily compared to anybody else, but it's like, I'm going to do everything that I possibly can. And then the other aspect was spend time and be really intentional about relationships within that space, because that's going to be just as important as the other aspect. And so I think those are the two healthy ways, but I also dealt with it in unhealthy ways. I also got to college and I didn't drink or do any of that kind of stuff when I was in high school. I did my first year in college, and then after that I started to, and that became a really unhealthy outlet for me, where I could drink, and I could drink to the point where I'd get drunk, and it allowed me to escape those expectations because I had an excuse. Well, I was drunk, and so I could be somebody that didn't have to be who everybody else wanted me to be, and I had an excuse because it wasn't really me. It was the drunk version of me. I could be somebody that could make a mistake, and I could be somebody that could, be wild, and I could do all of these things, and I didn't have to feel like I had the pressure to be whoever, and I could escape it for a little bit. And that became a definite coping mechanism for me when I was in college and kind of continued into my first year in the NFL as well.
Yeah, I'll be interested to hear how that turned around, but I wanted to make this jump into the NFL. So after you graduated, you were drafted in the first round, so still the expectations are high for you. How'd that feel to get drafted? I imagine the NFL was probably a dream of yours since you were playing sports since you were a kid. I mean, did it just feel like, wow, I've reached the mountaintop, like I did it? Or was it kind of for yourself, did you feel like this was always my expectation of myself? This is the logical next step.
No, I think it's really interesting. That's a great question. And to be totally honest, I don't remember. I don't remember what I felt like at that moment. I don't remember. I think I can recall times in my life, like a little thing when I was in kindergarten. What do you want to be when you grow up? It's like, oh, I want to be a professional football player. And so it's like I can see that I had those dreams from a young age, but then I can also very clearly remember, like, we never went to like Seahawks games or University of Washington games growing up. We went to Friday night Ferndale High School football games. And I can remember thinking, like, man, if I could play there, that would be like, that's a big
the pinnacle.
Deal.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. And I can remember in high school, and coach called me in. He's like, hey, you got a letter from Washington State. And it was hey, we're offering you a scholarship. And I'm like, what? I can remember in that moment being like, I never even considered this as like, I can go play in college as an option. I didn't think of it. That was just something I was playing and I enjoyed doing, and that was the extent of it for me. So I think to honestly answer that question, at that moment, I don't think I could honestly tell you like, oh, it felt like I had made it, or no, I expected to be there and I had I think it was a mixed emotions. It was like, yeah, I was excited to hear your name called, 8th overall. I was like,
wow.
Yeah, that was a exciting moment. It was an exciting moment.
Something that most people will just never experience.
Yeah, and I understood that. I understood that it was like, this was a really unique opportunity, and you're lucky. You're very lucky to be able to have this experience too. I understood that. I understood that very clearly. At the same time, I think that I had played competitive sport long enough to know that, yeah, that's great, but you're only as good as the last time that you performed. So that's awesome that you got drafted 8th, but essentially that's just kind of the springboard to now go prove that you were worthy of that.
It's not a trophy that then you go put on your shelf. This is just the beginning. Yeah,
it is 100%. The more you think about and consider competitive sport, I think that's always the reality. No matter how accomplished you are or how successful you are, there's another season that starts the next year. And I think that working through that is as much a part of that mental journey as anything.
So did it feel like a huge step up playing in the NFL from your college days? Was the game more complex, or the people bigger, or the pressure greater, or was it just kind of a natural evolution?
No, I think all the above, everything you hit on. It felt that way. The game was fast. It was so fast. It's the best athletes at their respective positions in the world that you're playing against and you're playing with. And it's unique. It's extremely unique. And you experience that every day. And then the more time you spend with it, it becomes normal. And you start to adjust to it. Not fully or completely and perfectly, but it's not as surprising as it was at first. It's your job too. You have wages tied to it. And with that comes expectations of time and commitment and understanding and serving your role. And those things they weren't new. College football,
kind of a job at that level.
Yeah,
Division I. Yeah,
100%. Too often, I think people are like, "Oh, they're students." It's like, yeah, no, they're full-time employees of the school, and they just happen to go to school full-time like everybody else too. When you're running out in front of 70,000 people every Saturday for 13 weeks in a row, and the whole school and the whole city's coming to watch. I mean,
Not to
your
mention television.
your math exam might take a back seat to that. So you got a little bit of a taste of it, but it's different. The expectation becomes greater and the time becomes greater, and it's very clearly understood as your one and only role then at that point.
Did the kind of brotherhood, for lack of a better word, feel different from the college team to the pro team? Or did you feel like you were able to bond in the same ways and support each other in the same ways at the pro level?
Not in the same ways. I wouldn't say that it was any less necessary. It's just different. It was very different. For me, walking into the college football locker room, we primarily had young men that were in the same stage of life, coming from different backgrounds. And so I think that adds some nuance to it for sure. But primarily, we're all kind of going through the same things at the same stages, interested in the same things or similar things. You're really kind of at this young man trying to figure out what it is to be a man. And we're all kind of in that space at that point. Where, walking into an NFL locker room is totally different. I walk in as a 23-year-old with 34-year-old teammates that have 3-4 grown kids that are in middle school. And it's like, that's a completely different reality, right? Like, our lives aren't going to look the same just because they can't.
Yeah.
We're just at different points in our life. So I think in that way, it does differ. Obviously, you're not spending as much time outside of just the sport with each other. But I think there's something really unique, really cool about sport that does bring people together around a common goal, better than most other places in our communities. I think it's one of the really beautiful things about sport is you get a collective whole of people that are from all kinds of different spaces and places and cultures and communities and races and ethnicities, and they all come together and there's a common goal, and that common goal is pretty clearly understood, and there's a standard that everybody collectively sees that's the same. And I think that's really unique about sport. As a player, I think that influences the relational experience, because you may have all kinds of differences with these guys, but you have one thing in common, and it would be hard to argue that one thing wasn't one of the most important things in everybody's life at that time. And so I think from that perspective, you still build really cool and unique relationships, because that's one thing sport really offers that I think is, like I said, is totally unique. Because there's pressure, there is expectation, all those things are a part of it, and everybody feels it collectively. And so it's like you do have this inner group that can relate to those things, that understands those things, that is going through the same thing as you are. And that's unique to almost anybody else that you're around, because you could have great friends, but they can't understand what that feels like.
Yeah, other people in other jobs have performance goals they have to meet, but they're not being judged on winning and losing every week.
And those performance goals aren't going to be televised on ESPN, on Sports Center, 4 different hours of the day, so
torn
everybody
apart
can see
by
them,
analysts.
Yeah, totally. So I think and you all inherently understand that inside the locker room, I think.
Did you have any mentors or people that kind of helped you when you were a rookie and your first years, people that helped you learn the ropes?
Yeah, definitely. I got to be in a room with Matt Hasselbeck, who came from Seattle, and, I think it was like his 14th year in the league at that point. And so, he was a great influence on me. I got to be in the same quarterback room with Rusty Smith, who's still one of my closest friends to this day. And then I got to play with, like Ryan Fitzpatrick, and that was a really fun, unique experience for me as well. I got to play with Charlie Whitehurst, and so I got to play with these guys that have been around the game for a while and been in different places and experienced it from different perspectives and in different organizations, and got to see how they coped, the healthy and unhealthy outlets they used for some of the expectations that they had.
So you mentioned Matt Hasselbeck. I read an article in Sports Illustrated, and I thought this was a really interesting quote, so I want to get your feedback on it. So this is Matt Hasselbeck saying, "Every coach I ever played for says these are the priorities: faith, family, football. But no one really lives that way. No one." But then he went on to say that you, Jake Locker, actually did live that way. So I was just curious your thoughts on that quote and kind of what in you made yourself decide to have those priorities and live them out.
Yeah. It's funny that Matt would say that. Matt and his wife invited us to this conference actually after our first year. My wife and I got baptized at that. It was a Christian conference. We got baptized at the conference and gave our lives to the Lord at that point. And then, I've been faithfully seeking him and learning what it looks like to walk with him since then. And it's been an imperfect journey, as it is for all of us, but it's been a wonderful one that I wouldn't trade for anything. And so I think at that point in my career, we were at the conference. My wife was pregnant with our first child, my daughter, Colby. The worship leader, kind of sharing their story a little bit. The worship leader is Lecrae. He's a Christian rapper. And he talked about how for him, when he essentially surrendered his life to seek and follow the Lord and to trust him rather than himself, he said, I realized I was living two lives. And he kind of just shared how he came to the understanding that your life isn't your own, whether you are following Jesus or not. Because when you're not, you have all these other idols. So he's like, it's drugs or it's music or it's fame. He's like, and I'm worshiping all these things because I've become their servant. I've become their slave. And I felt like he was talking to me. I felt like I was the only one in the room. I heard that. I'm like, yeah, I'm not following Jesus. He's not the Lord of my life. And I'm doing it because I think that gives me control over my life. And yet I see that I have these other idols that they have complete control over my life. And I'm serving them. My identity is found as Jake Locker, the football player. And thus I am doing whatever I can to serve that identity. And so I'm a slave to that identity. I'm a slave to that title. It's my master. And I began to see that. And when I did, then I just found freedom in the pursuit of Christ, who set me free from obligation to those things. And I think that's where things changed. And that was something that Matt really encouraged and modeled really well. So did Rusty for me in my first year. So yeah, super grateful for the role that he served in multiple ways, in multiple facets, his wife as well. With my wife, for me personally, I had a really hard time being in that reality and not being consumed by that reality. So I had a really hard time increasingly of playing the game and yet it not being my idol. Like, how do I do that? How do I do that well? How do I compete in the way that I want to the level that I'd like to, and to honestly, to the level that I feel I owe those around me to compete to, when it isn't my first priority? How do I do that? How does that play out?
No wonder. And, I mean, that had been your entire life, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's hard to just switch to anything really quickly. And your whole life had been growing into this and getting more notoriety and success. And so no wonder that you couldn't just immediately say, oh, I can hold these two things equally. That's a real transition.
It is 100%. And so I think that for me, that really was the beginning of the next 3 years of my life and what that looked like. And ultimately the point in my career that a lot of people would point to, but that was a process. There was so much involved in that. And I think that if I'm being honest, I look at it from me in my heart, the Lord was helping me find freedom from something that I was going to be a slave to the rest of my life if he didn't come in.
Which wasn't necessarily football, but it was more the success and the notoriety.
Yeah, definitely. And it was football at that moment because that's where I primarily saw myself finding it or fulfilling it, right? But yeah, I mean, I look at it now and you're exactly right. I think that if that doesn't happen in my life, then who knows how long you're playing for, but you're always chasing that affirmation within that space until you're told you can't anymore, right? Because that inevitably comes for all of us at some point. If that's that idol or that master in my life, then it's just going to be parlayed into the next thing. And so whatever it is then in that next space, you're going to be chasing that same affirmation from the fulfillment of that role that you're serving.
You know, I find it so interesting. I'm sure you lived with this through your years of college fame and being in the NFL and all that, but just media scrutiny and articles probably written about you or about your team or something that you think, this isn't quite it. You know, this is your take on it. But as I was researching, preparing for this interview, one article that I read, there's just this, he probably retired early or stopped playing football, however it was phrased in the media, because he had some injuries. And then I'm talking to you, and it's a completely different journey. It's an internal journey. It's a spiritual journey. It's so complex and layered. And to have something just reduced into some simplistic thing, and then other people just speculating on your life. Did that feel strange or reductive or off-putting to you to have people question your decision?
Oh, 100%. I think that I'm be careful how I say this, I guess, but I had a really hard time with media while I played, and I'll be totally honest. And I think that I can say this, and it's not connected to any individual, but I can remember having conversations with our media director and being like, "Look, man, hey, you got to interact a little bit more." And I'm like, "No, I don't want to." I'm gonna give them the same short answers because all they're trying to do is get people to read the paper. It's like they don't really care. And that was my perspective. Maybe I'm wrong. And I think that that's a blanket statement. And this is me expressing where I felt like I was in, the
Yeah,
space
that's
that I
fair.
was in.
Sure.
But I did. I think 17, 18 years old, you have these people that are projecting your thoughts to all these people that are reading, and you're reading it going like, that's completely untrue. And they didn't even talk to me. And they don't know me. They don't know who I am. They never cared to get to know who I am.
Well, I
But
can tell you just I worked in local TV news for a bit, so from the other side, and it is true what you're saying. Our job, I didn't work in sports, but was to go out and you need to get sound bites and you need to make a
mhm.
short story. And so there's no room for context. And I'm not excusing the genre or something, but it's one reason I really like podcasting is because you can have a longer time to actually have
Yeah.
conversations and actually get into some of the detail and give some of the background and all of that. It's not just a soundbite or a headline world.
Yeah, no doubt. At the same time, like I've heard and received the argument on the other side that's like, well, then the athlete, me, I have to be open to extending myself to people for those periods of time so that they have the capacity to receiving that. And I understand that. And I think the reality of it is you just don't have the time to do that. There's just not time for
Yeah.
that. If you're somebody that's in that space, that's dedicated to it, you have a family. And so I think a lot of it comes back to the fact that athletics is the Coliseum. Right, wrong, or indifferent, there's so many good things about it. I think there's so many things that are really difficult about it. I love it. I love sport. I love what it offers and what it brings to our communities. I just think that it's really important. I would take the opportunity for fans, viewers, anybody, just to never forget that those people are human beings, and yeah, they have a gift, but so do you, so does everybody, and our gifts are just different. And the gift they've been given for some reason is culturally put on a pedestal. But we're going through a lot of the same emotions that everybody else is going through. We're trying to learn and experience life just like everybody else is doing it. We just don't have a lot of times the freedom to do it privately. It's public. And so when we screw up, you all know about it. When we're less than what we would like to be, you all know about it. And so I think it's important to know and to remember and to realize that the men and women that are competing in athletics, they're not doing that because they have to be. We love it. We enjoy doing it. But at the same time, just because we do and because it's played on a stage doesn't mean that we get to deal with them as like a separate set of human beings. There's only one difference, and it's that God chose to give you speed or height or strength. Like, that's it. That's it. And those are all gifts that we'll lose at some point too. And
Yeah. It doesn't
and
last
so
forever.
yeah.
So you did decide to end your NFL career much earlier than a lot of people would have expected. And, you could have made a lot more money, but you didn't. And so when you made that decision, I'm curious how you felt. Did it feel like a weight off your shoulders, or was it a sadness, or was it relief?
Yeah. To label it with any single emotion would probably be inaccurate. It was all the things that you said. Like I said, I still love the game. This weekend was the first weekend of college football in the NFL, and I watched games. I love the game. I love it. I went to a high school game on Saturday and watched college games on Saturday and watched some NFL games. Like, I love
So
football.
it's fun
I
for you
love
to
it.
watch. It
Yeah,
does
I
give you
love
a
it.
little ting, like, oh, I wish I could be
Oh,
out there.
definitely, definitely. And I think there was times that I had that, especially right on the heels of it, being like, man, I physically I know I can still do it, mentally I know I can still do it. Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if I told you I didn't have those moments, but I think I'd also be lying to you if I told you that drove me to a place where I second guessed or was dissatisfied with where my life is now, and that's not the case at all. I'm grateful for where my life is. I'm grateful for what I'm getting to be involved in and engaged in. Do I miss the game? Heck yeah, I miss the game. That was a unique experience, and there's not a whole lot of other things that mimic that experience. Would I trade it for the things that I'm getting to engage in my life right now? No, I wouldn't. I'm very much at a place where I'm thankful for the time that I got, grateful for the people that I got to be with, grateful for sport in and of itself. Value it. I think that it's a wonderful space, but also look at it through a different lens, like with our children. And I find it challenging to try and find that healthy balance of what it looks like, where it's something you get to do and it's a sport created for fun and play. But the reality that there is expectation, there is pressure, and that's not bad inherently. But when it becomes the main thing, it can be. And so, how do you steward your children through that? How do you steward young athletes through that? I don't have the answers to that. I know the framework that you can work from that allows you to begin to understand how you could walk through that, but I don't know if there's one like model. We're right where we're supposed to be when we're in that tension. And to remove ourselves from that tension is to go too far on one side or the other. Is the right thing just to not play sports at all? Nah, I don't think that's the right thing. Is the right thing just to go all in and make it king? No, I don't think that's the right thing either. And so you have to then live in this really difficult tension that changes and that shifts. And it's probably going to be different for each child. It's in that tension that I realize that I can't satisfy on my own. I don't have the answers for my kids, and I'm not the answer. And that's a really healthy place for me.
So is that kind of, in a nutshell, the journey that you took over those 3 years of your final football career was just this exploration of how do I want my life to look and what should this balance be for me and what am I putting as my idol? And then you finally came to this decision.
Yep.
I was curious about people closest to you, what their reaction was when you did decide to end your career.
Yeah, I think that I always had people that were in it, not because of what I could do, but because of who I was from the time I was a kid. And so I always knew that the people closest to me, whether they understood it or whether they agreed with it, they were never going to project that onto me. They loved me, they cared about me, and ultimately they understood that it wasn't their decision. And I think that they all respected that. And so I can honestly tell you that I don't know. I didn't have a ton of people really close to me voicing me their opinion other than, hey, we love you and we're going to be a part of your life whether you're playing or not. And so that's what I experienced. I think more from the peripheral, I heard like, oh, you're so stupid, or, oh, that's a great decision. It's like, it was everything all over the board. So, but to be honest,
those people projected their own selves into you. They wish they could have had the opportunity.
At the end of the day, I was at a place in my life at that point then where I was okay with that. I understood that making that decision wasn't going to be a private one. It was a public one. I knew that. I understood that. I understood people have their varying opinions. I understood I'd have some people that agreed with me, some people that didn't. I understood that I'd have some people that would totally misunderstand it, that would paint it for something that it wasn't. I understood all of those things. I think I had experienced enough to that point to know that. And so that didn't have too great of an effect on me just because it's kind of what I expected.
So can you just walk me through kind of a typical day now? Do you feel like you've found that balance that you were seeking more?
I would say that it's not a typical day. There's not like a...
You have little kids, there is no typical day.
Yeah, every day looks a little bit different. But I can say that in Matthew, it tells us that in him his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And I think the best way for me to describe it is I'm just thankful to experience that, to know what it feels like to carry an easy yoke and a light burden. Because when I'm trusting him, that's what it feels like. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't know what the outcomes are going to be. And you're engaged in a lot of things that are messy. But he brings beauty to a lot of that chaos and brings purpose and understanding and this long-term perspective that doesn't allow you to be tossed by the wind on a daily basis, right? Because you're planted firmly in something that's lasting.
So you moved back to your hometown, right? And you renovated your grandma's house, and that's your family home now?
Yep, it is.
And you coach football?
I did for the first 5 or 6 years that I was back. And now I got my 2 oldest sons play a little flag football, so I'm coaching their flag football team now. Watching my daughter, she's playing a little soccer, so we've got their stuff going on now.
Next gen of Locker athletes.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, thank you, Jake. Boy, I really appreciate how open and thoughtful you've been about your life and your perspective on all this. It's really been interesting to me. So thanks for spending all this time with me.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, and grateful for the opportunity to visit with you.
I'm so grateful to Jake for taking the time to talk with me about his journey. By the way, he ended the interview in the gym he owns, which is called The Locker Room. Get it? The Locker Room? Jake left me with a lot of food for thought. Here are some of my takeaways from our conversation. Number 1, build relationships. Find people to get bored with. Make up things to do together. Be creative. These are things that forge deep, lasting bonds. 2, follow your heart, even if it leads you away from signing a piece of paper that would earn you millions of dollars. Greater rewards come with pursuing your purpose. 3, there's always another hill to climb, another game to play, another season to compete in. So when the wins come in life, celebrate them. 4, if you're new to an organization, search for mentors. If you're a veteran, be a mentor. This kind of learning and helping is how we all move forward. 5, be thoughtful about how you're spending your time, what you're chasing, and what you're putting on a pedestal. And finally, number 6, everyone has special gifts, but in our society, some are spotlighted and paid more handsomely for theirs. That doesn't mean they're more worthy. A huge thanks to Jake Locker for sharing his story with me. If you'd like to learn more about Jake, please go to our website, whatitslike2.net, and check out the show notes for this episode. If you like athlete stories, you might want to listen to episodes 35 and 36 with professional baseball player Joe Biagini. And if you're into the NFL, you may want to check out episode 6. I interviewed CBS Sports producer Ken Mack, who produces NFL games each week and has also worked on several Super Bowls. If you're not already following this podcast, please do. And please tell a few friends about us too. I'm Elizabeth Pearson Garr. Thanks for being curious about what it's like.